why don't you talk about some of the life-saving programming that you are putting forth as solutions?
Sure, and it's a great context. And the only thing I would add, Will, is why when we started to talk about those risk factors, to your point, we have to talk about it in the context of structural racism, structural classism, and again, disparate impact more broadly. Um, because if we don't, not only do I not think we understand again long term what's driving these issues, because again, all of those things like you mentioned intersect with race. I would also add class with who we see disproportionately impacted at that intersection of race and class. But also, if we don't talk about it in that context, the answers get real racist and also real classist real fast. Where if I, for example, were to say, young Black men are most victimized and those most involved in gun violence, and I don't put those risk factors in any context, you can see how people that may not have those experiences may jump to the conclusion that maybe this is a set of individuals in some way predisposed to this kind of involvement. And obviously that's not remotely true, but without that context, the way people's brains work, particularly if they have grown up learning those racial biases, those class
Yeah, I was about to
biases.
say, what people are we talking about here, Nick?
Yeah,
Because,
everybody, right? Everybody.
well,
And it
it's
also
definitely not
especially,
everyone the same. Like,
yeah,
I don't think a lot of Black people grew up like thinking that Black people have a predisposition to violence. I
yeah,
know that some do, but like,
yeah,
I don't think most of us do. So, like, I just have to
yeah,
say that I have to be clear about that because
you're
this
right.
is kind of what I'm getting at, in fact, which is that like
Yeah,
racism divides us much in a much starker way than people think about it as. It's at the level of thought. So this is a good example because while
yeah,
yeah, a lot of people might hear that, right, and think, oh, like it probably means something about them. But like a Black male is not typically going to think that about themselves. Sometimes they
yeah,
will internalize those messages, right? As like anyone would internalize anything that they're taught from the outside if they accept. But most
yeah,
Black people do not accept because
yeah.
so I just want to put that out there. That's like a differential response based on the racial hierarchy, I would say.
No, I couldn't agree more. And what I meant by everyone, will, to clarify, is when all of us as human beings have these existing cognitive biases and we intersect those with these realities of who is most exposed and not to these challenges because of structural racism, classism, et cetera. We see, yeah, disproportionate views in who thinks what you just said. And so to build on what you just said and agree with you 100%, minus some of the internalization we do see with some folks affected, is that, yeah, this is primarily non-Black people that hold these opinions. And again, even more specifically, even like poor Black people that we work with. And so I think absolutely right and couldn't agree more. And that's why that context is so important. And to bridge us into that question around like, what do we do about this? What I would largely say is that I would break this up into sort of like four main categories: intervention, prevention, coordination, and root cause in terms of addressing those root causes. Societal, community, some of the things we talked about. Structural racism, obviously, is a root cause. So, all that being said, I'll start with sort of defining these things. When I talk about intervention and violence reduction, we have a pretty specific definition again. So I already alluded to it before, but we are talking about treating and interrupting and interacting with those already at highest risk of gun violence involvement. So think of young men, again, typically 18 to 34, that hit all those risk factors we talked about because of the context of all of these isms, particularly racism that we're discussing. They're already there in terms of disproportionate likelihood of involvement. And so if we want to disrupt that transmission, like we do in disease control, we have to work with those at absolute highest risk, that 0.2% I referenced before. And often these programs are doing that interruption through what we call credible messengers. These are individuals that they themselves, because of risk factors they were exposed to, were involved with community violence in the past and aren't anymore because of protective factors that got them out, right? and frankly, second chances, hope that was built up for them through different programming that we'll get into.
It's kind of like your own personal experience. Isn't that correct? It kind of mirrors that somewhat.
It does, but this I would be even more specific. And so, like in the case of myself as like a researcher and why I'm interested in the topics that I am and my personal experiences, I think you're right more broadly. But I would not be a person that I think would be adequate as a credible messenger, given how specific the experiences of those most involved, particularly for young Black men. And so, when we talk about credible messengers, again, these are often folks that were themselves involved in gun violence and crucially are out of it. And even more crucially, still have social connections to those most at risk. And they often, because of their prior experience, and importantly to this conversation, relatability, not just relatability and experience, but because of that experience, quite literally, these are often also young Black men and women or older young Black men and women that grew up in these neighborhoods, are connected to these networks and have some kind of respect. So that's what we mean by credible messengers. And essentially, we deploy those credible messengers to find those at highest risk based on some of those behavioral, relational, individual risk factors that I talked about. By definition, it's often in our most impacted communities that are the ones most impacted because of this context we keep referring to in terms of these different isms, particularly racism. And with all that in mind, they interrupt the transmission by relentlessly engaging those at highest risk. They treat those at highest risk, often getting them connected to cognitive behavioral intervention and any programming that addresses often their broad basic needs. So we see housing, employment, those are probably the biggest two, in addition to the significant trauma that they have and need to address through things like CBI, cognitive behavioral intervention. But also it could be things like getting connected to different social services programs they may not be connected to, like SNAP, for example, and just long-term connecting them to the opportunities that may show them a way out, which is to what I mentioned earlier, Will, could be a place where programming like you mentioned and you do could tie in, for example. And then beyond that, more broadly, the focus for not just those at highest risk, but often these communities more broadly, because of the normalization of this problem, because of the risk factors that still exist, and people getting desensitized to it over time, is that we try to change behaviors and norms at the individual level and the community level. So that's what we mean by intervention programs. Some programs that we are investing in currently that hit all of those notes pretty exactly are things like Cure Violence, which is a international violence reduction program that started in Chicago. It was formed by folks in these communities doing this work, in addition to public health researchers. So coming together to build this violence interruption program, which encompasses everything I just talked about, in the short version at least. And also programs like Ready Chicago, which, as you may hear in that, were also developed in Chicago, which applies a lot of the same principles, but structures it slightly differently in terms of an intervention approach, where rather than doing real-time mediation, de-escalation, interruption like our cure teams do as described, they are also relentlessly involving those at highest risk, but trying to get them in a structured program that is often designed 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and looks like a work day, where we basically disguise the program as a workforce development program, but really it's a violence reduction program. So we offer the carrot of paying someone a subsidy to complete cognitive behavioral intervention, which is delivered by credible messengers, and attend workforce development and professional development programming while having a paid transitional job. And why we think it works is because of the exposure to some of those therapeutic interventions, and also just the long-term stability of having this paycheck, and also practicing, importantly, a lot of what they're learning in CBI at the workplace with supervision. And so these are all factors that we think can reduce violence, and both Cure Violence and Ready Chicago, which we're adapting here in Allegheny County, have both been shown, when done well, significantly reduce gun violence at the individual level, and in Cure Violence's sake at the community level. That said, all these programs are mixed. If you have anyone you talk to that say there is a silver bullet perfect program to this problem, they're full of shit, is the short version. But these are programs that seem to work more than they don't, or at least based on initial studies are really promising, and we should invest in these programs. So those are intervention programs. When we talk about prevention programs, think a little more upstream. So we want to make sure that at-risk youth in that community, based on all those risk factors they are likely exposed to, or if they're exposed to, they could become that 18 to 34-year-old most involved. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. And so these are often what I would call short to midterm prevention programs, where we're focusing on youth primarily, particularly those in grades 6 through 12, given that the likelihood of other risk factors increases around those ages. And so essentially, these are programs that, for that broader at-risk population, generally deploy similar tactics, just in a broader, less concentrated way. So getting folks connected to cognitive behavioral intervention, often delivered in a peer support sort of group network is often involved. And again, trying to connect youth to what we would call future orientation more broadly. Like going on trips to a college campus, for example, is huge. Even though I, again, grew up in a different context of risk factors, similar but different based on the earlier conversation we had, I didn't step foot on a college campus until I was like 20 years old. And like that shapes a lot of your expectations about where you can go in life. And so while this may seem like a really simple by the dots answer, I promise you that it is impactful for young men in particular, particularly youth, who may only see that their older people in their lives are getting involved with the carceral system, or they're only seeing some of their friends get shot down. They may think, because of that hopelessness, that that's pretty much going to be their outcome. And when you think like that, you're only making short-term decisions. And so a lot of these prevention programs try to orient people towards opportunities they may not have because of the economic conditions they often find themselves in such a segregated, isolated setting, and try to connect them with those opportunities. A good program that we're funding that hits all those marks is called Becoming a Man, was also developed in Chicago, and we're using it here in Allegheny County in a number of our high schools, where they do all of what I just said, also delivered through, again, credible messengers that are hired to deliver these programs, with a focus on hiring local people, as is with our intervention programs especially. So that's prevention. And to get to some of the other ones, we have to talk about coordination. So that may seem like implicitly like, yeah, do that. What I want to tell you, Will, we're really bad at doing that. And so that's where I want to make sure that I'm calling it out specifically, almost as in its own light. So if we are delivering intervention programs, prevention programs, and broader investment strategies to address these, hundreds of years long inequities, we're not going to do it if we don't work together. And so the line that I really like that describes what we need to do between all these different kinds of programs and longer term goals in addressing the structures is everyone involved should have a lane. Everyone should stay in their lane, but everyone should work together. And that speaks to the need for specialization, including some of the programs I just named, because when we get too broad, we see that these programs are less effective. Because this is a focused problem. So your solution has to be focused. This is not just case management. This is a very particular set of skills targeted at a very specific population experiencing tremendous risk. You are not going to get by just saying, I'm a caseworker, I'll hook you up with SNAP. It is a lot more specific and oriented than that. But if we have partners doing these different programs, especially when they're working with the same clients, our clients that may be connected to risk, let's say when a shooting happens and there might be fear of retaliation, we have to talk to each other. And I'll talk about a little bit of that more in a minute. And then lastly, root causes. So obviously, broadly, we have to address, again, some of those root causes we talked about. Structural racism more broadly, and I would also add intersectionally, which is key here, and I'll harp on it, also classism, given our communities most impacted, not just our Black communities, they are low to moderate income Black communities and low to moderate income Black young men. And also different gender expectations. So I would argue we have to hit misogyny, we have to hit toxic masculinity, and these are really broad things, Will, right? Like it's like that's a lot societally, culturally, but long-term, we have to root those things out if we talk about really addressing some of these root causes. But even in a more microcosm of that, which I think we can get a lot of gains with even in the coming decades, because those structures are going to take a long time to disassemble. and rework to be equitable and inclusive, right? But when we talk about those community level risk factors I talked about, particularly the concentration of poverty, social isolation, legal cynicism, those are things we can and work on now that, again, are the product of those isms we just talked about, particularly structural racism. But by approaching different equitable investment strategies that are born for and by the community, that focus on things like, say, mixed income development, increasing access to affordable housing in low poverty and wealthy neighborhoods, which historically, because of our history, particularly racism, are never built there. There's a lot we can do even in the next 10, 15, 20 years at a community level that can impact this issue. All of these things I just said, they take money and a lot of it, and they take political will. And we can do both of those things. We just have to work towards them. So that's like the broad set of what we're doing. The only last thing I'll end on, and then again, happy to take this conversation wherever you want to, Will, is that coordination, I'm going to bring up again in a different context we're working with. So for some context for folks to know, all the programs I just talked about, we didn't do this in a vacuum. I alluded to it before, but I maybe should have started with this point. Not only were most of these programs, if not all of them, created by practitioners who are from these communities, working in these communities, often partnering with different researchers, particularly at the University of Chicago, which is why you hear so many of these Chicago programs. But they are delivered by them and they have to be bought in by them. And so when we look at this sort of initiative that I have not yet named, but encompasses all the stuff I just talked about, and here in Allegheny County, we call it the Allegheny County Community Violence Reduction Initiative. And it's a partnership explicitly with our community-based organizations and other governmental agencies in the county that have neighborhoods most impacted by this problem. And so with this initiative, it is at least a 5-year commitment here in Allegheny County, but longer. We say the 5 years because of how our contract cycles work. And it is a sustainable funding commitment of at least $50 million over at least the next 5 years. That is the largest investment in public health approaches to violence reduction, covering those programs I just mentioned, particularly the intervention and prevention side, that we have ever invested in the county. And it's still not enough, but is a hell of a lot more than what was traditionally done, which was nothing, or at least a little, right? Often patched together with a lot of these organizations fighting over small amounts of foundation money. The money we're talking about is government subsidy that we get from the federal and state government. And the way we get it and have gone after it, it is sustainable forms of funding, as long as we can call it that, right? Absent people taking it away. And with that being said, that's one of the reasons folks don't coordinate well, is because historically, the way our foundation systems are set up and the way that this trauma in these spaces is real because of who's most doing this work, which is those impacted by the work often, these organizations don't get along. And so there's this great irony that we see in violence reduction where we're trying to engage those most at risk and, again, give them another opportunity to get out of this through the services we talked about. But a lot of these organizations are beefing themselves because of some of that competition historically, because of these funding and trauma issues, right? And so the coordination we're building is to try to prevent that by saying, hey, this is funding for all of these major groups doing this work and also minor ones, and it's sustainable, and you don't have to compete for this tiny amount of money from foundations that you historically have. And so what we did is we went to these communities most impacted by violence, and we literally asked them to A, put together a violence reduction plan. Our only caveat is that it has to do with violence reduction. And we asked them to pick at least one of our promising programs, some of which I named, but we encourage people to actually incorporate all of them if they had the commitment to carry them out. And second, like other programs we may not have named that are maybe innovations they're working on that may be promising someday, are ones that we just didn't know about, right? And so put that violence reduction plan together, get your partners involved. And second, pick a lead agency, which we call the community quarterback, to oversee and make sure that that program actually moves forward. So we build in coordination at the local level, and we also build in at the county level. And that's the last part I'll get to here. which is what we're currently doing, is across all of our municipalities most impacted by gun violence, which themselves have a small number of neighborhoods in the most impacted. We are building out a rapid response system to make sure, in short, that if someone gets shot in, say, a suburb outside of Pittsburgh that's higher need, that there is an intervention team designated to do that initial response to de-escalate and prevent further retaliation. And if, which is often the case from what we hear, there is any connection to high-risk people living in other impacted communities, that they are explicitly working with those intervention teams to prevent retaliation. That may sound simple. I promise you it's not. We have 20 municipalities containing our neighborhoods most impacted by violence in the county. We have 130 municipalities overall. And each of those 20 municipalities has their own government. They often have their own police force. They have different programs, some of which I named, but other ones too. And they historically, for the reasons I said, haven't worked together, particularly across municipal lines, let alone within the same neighborhood. And so this system is essentially a protocol developed with all of those intervention partners, whether they be like programs like CURE or interruption programs connected to violence intervention programs more broadly, hospital-based response teams that do this kind of work, but with gunshot wound victims in the hospital, and rapid trauma response agencies that do this stuff in terms of arriving on the scene, providing psychological first aid, making sure that, again, everyone has a lane, everyone stays in their lane, but everyone works together. And so we're developing a real-time alert system to alert people that when a shooting occurs, so they can get in there in the area they're designated to cover, doing the things they're supposed to do, and work together to prevent retaliation. And that system long-term, after we get it off the ground, is going to get to the prevention side. So what can we do to make sure that a shooting doesn't happen to begin with, utilizing those same partners I named, but also these broader short to midterm prevention programs. And lastly, I keep thinking of more stuff, Will. We are making sure that all of these efforts, in addition to rapid response, are coordinated countywide. And so what we are working to do is, through one of our strong community-based partners that's in Pittsburgh's Hill District and has historically done a ton of facilitation work in our low to moderate income communities, many of which, because of our history, are Black communities, as you know, is that they are working to bring together government partners, intervention and prevention partners, our hospital systems, investors, including foundations and private firms, in addition to government money, and get everyone on the same goal of reducing gun violence to zero and helping us get through those different specialties, and especially long-term addressing the root causes that we keep talking about contextually. So that is, as always, a long answer to your short question, but there's a lot going on in terms of what we're doing to reduce gun violence. And all of these factors I mentioned do show promise based on the literature in reducing gun violence, not just in the short term, but also in the long term. And so these programs can work if you do them well and you design them with communities to get the trust, because they were often themselves designed by communities. If you don't do that, none of this shit works. I can say, here's the silver bullet. I didn't actually discuss it with you at all. Go ahead and do it. And I'm telling you, no one's going to do it because you didn't get what's critical, which is their expertise in knowing this problem better than almost anyone else. And so I'll end with that. But that's essentially what we're doing.
Thank you so much for giving us that rundown, for a number of reasons. One, because people always want to know, well, what are we doing about it, or what can we do? I mean, people rarely get so explicit about solutions as you did, and it's because you're in a position to actually bring some of these, these solutions to bear and actually make them happen, which is incredible.